In my time coaching thousands of students over the last almost 4 years now, I've encountered many different problems that people have struggled with. Some people have issues with their agents, others with their confidence, and many players need some help in their decision making. Of course, everyone knows that working on fundamentals like aim, movement, and gun mechanics is important for improvement, but there are plenty of smaller things that can still make a big difference as well. Hey guys, it's Konpeki here, and today I want to go over 3 things I teach all my students that normally aren't really talked about, but are each extremely important for improving faster and having more success in game. Oh, and real quick, if you're tired of being hard stuck and wasting your time trying to improve on your own, my team of Radiant coaches and I will help you climb 500 RR guaranteed or your money back inside our premium 10-week coaching program called the Immortal Roadmap Program. Inside our private community, you'll be getting access to live lessons, scrims, and one-on-ones from 1K RR Radiant coaches and world-class championship level coaches such as Comet, who's a current coach on Vitality that just qualified for champs, and Milan, who is a current coach on Giant X, and he was a coach on Ascend when they won champs in 2021. We only have 11 spots left before the next season that starts in 2 weeks. So if you're someone who's serious about ranking up, book a free call with me or one of our coaches using the link in the description below to see if we'd be a good fit. Now back to the video. The first tip that we're starting off with is all about improving your decision making in game. Now, when I watch student VODs, I often see that they have a hard time making confident decisions. A lot of the time, players know what their end goal is, namely winning the round, but they're really not so sure about how to get there. Of course, you can just run it down and fight anyone you come across, but almost everybody realizes that there are smarter ways to play the game. But that's where the problems arise though. Playing smart means considering a huge amount of factors that are constantly changing. There's a lot to take in at all times, and that makes people really indecisive, as they either end up second guessing themselves or they won't do much of anything at all because they're not sure what to do. That's where using a basic decision-making framework comes in. Allow me to explain. The first thing you need to consider is which team has the advantage. Usually that's not actually all that difficult, as you can get a pretty good idea based on just the players that are alive. If your team has 2 players alive and your enemy has 4, they clearly have the advantage. If your team just planted the spike and it's a 2v1, you also clearly have the upper hand. Naturally, the more familiar you become with estimating which team is on the winning end at any given moment, the more factors you can start to consider. Think about weaponry, ultimates, positional advantages like flanks, the round timer, and the list goes on. But again, if you're just starting out with this framework, try to keep it simple and focus mostly on just the number of players alive. So you might ask, why do we need to know which team has the advantage anyway? Well, that's because depending on which team is leading the round, we know whether we should play passively and try to group up with our teammates or go for more aggressive plays and try to look for duels or gaps wherever possible. The reason for that is actually quite simple. Let's say some of your teammates died early and you're in a 3v5. While anything can still happen, because you're down in players, you're not expected to win this round if the enemy team just plays their trades. But for the sake of the argument, let's say your chances of winning are about 35%. Well now, taking a 50-50 fight is actually a big win for you. Your chances of winning the round by doing nothing are around 35%, and it's going to continue to drop the more you don't do anything about it. But if the chances of you winning the duel itself is around 50%, that means by taking that fight, not only are you taking a fight that you have a higher chance of winning than the round itself, which also means that you actually have more to gain than you have to lose. But because of the snowballing nature of Valorant, you also have the opportunity to take a lot of map control because of that potential kill. Basically, whenever you're down on players, you want to look for duels, even if the duels aren't necessarily favorable for you. The more unlikely you are to win the round, the more risks you should be willing to take. That also means when you're down in numbers, you should avoid things like rushing into sites or especially planting the spike. If you're in a 1v4 clutch, don't try to make it a 1v4 where your movement is restricted because you also have to defend the spike. Try to take a fight first. If the enemy is not giving it to you, maybe tap the spike and see if that can bait out a peek or 2, and then maybe get another kill or 2 and get it down to a 1v2 or even better a 1v1 before you can plant. And of course, the opposite is true as well. If your team is heavily on the winning end, you don't need to take risks. If we're in a 4v2 and we estimate our chances of winning the round to be about 80%, taking a fair 50-50 duel is a really bad idea. If you're up in players, you should be looking to play trades. If you're standing next to your teammates, it's unlikely an enemy kills both of you guys, and if you trade 1 for 1, that 4v2 turns into a 3v1, which is even harder for your enemy to win. That also means that especially if you're on the attacker side, you should not be afraid to freeze for a bit and slowly group up with your team as you take your sweet time to eventually end up on a site together. This is especially true because if your enemies realize that they're on the back foot, they might decide to push or go for an aggressive play like we just talked about. And therefore, playing more carefully means you and your teammates are more prepared for those types of plays. Now, depending on whether you're attacking or defending, the round will play out a bit differently. But on defense, worst case scenario, by playing passive, you and your teammates go into a very favorable retake. And if you're on attack, worst case scenario, if your enemies don't go for an aggressive push, they also have no info, and it's unlikely that you'll run into a stack. Basically, try to dumb down the decision-making process wherever possible. And really, it isn't all that hard. If you're on the losing end, taking fair fights means your chances of winning the round increase, but if you're already winning, it's better to focus on trading and turning your advantage into a certain win. It goes without saying that just knowing the framework doesn't guarantee victory every round though. That's because you also need to have a solid round-to-round game plan, including proper contingencies when things don't go as anticipated. And that's where the second tip comes in. I think most players would agree that coming up with a plan A isn't the hardest thing to do in Valorant. In the lower elos especially, it's very common for players to simply group up on one side at the start of the round, and often without saying anything, the assumption is just to rush that site. And guess what? I'm not even gonna criticize you for that. Sure, rushing every round might not be the best idea, but overall, rushing is an easy to execute ranked friendly strategy that works at least decently a lot of the time. So the real problem is actually something else. The problem is not having a proper plan B in case plan A, or in this case, 5-man rushing a site, fails. If your plan is to rush A, that's fine. If your plan is to rush A 6 rounds in a row, that's also fine. But problems only start to arise when you're ill prepared for the inevitable situation that your plan A stops working. Maybe your enemies barrage the main choke point with util. Maybe they've stacked the site you planned on rushing. Or maybe your plan wasn't all that great to begin with. At any rate, you need to be prepared to change up the round and transition into something different. Of course, depending on what your original plan looked like, your adaptation should also look a bit different. But in general, when you commit many players to a specific part of the map like you do in a rush scenario, it's a good idea to take back map control before anything else. That is transitioning back into a default setup. So what exactly is a default setup? It's basically spreading your team out across the map to regain control and gather information. The reason you want to do that is because when you put all your players into one small area of the map, your enemies can push pretty much everywhere else, which allows them to get into nasty positions and flank your team on multiple fronts. This means that if you go for a quick rotate, you might be met with a backstab you weren't quite ready for. And alternatively, if you don't move and just stay in your position, your enemies will have more and more time to flank you, get information that you're not there in that part of the map, which will make your position increasingly obvious so that you're extremely likely to run into a stacked site. Since neither of those scenarios are too welcoming, the option you're left with is taking your time to reset the round and clearing out the map safely so that you can either kill any potential enemies that pushed out or otherwise leaving your enemies without information about your team's positioning. That way, you can eventually transition back into a site hit without the fear of running into a stacked site. Now, it should be mentioned that you can't control your teammates. If they aren't willing to move, you can't force them to. However, in solo queue, you can still achieve a lot on your own. If your team is insistent on keeping 4 players in main, you can fall back into a passive lurk through mid. If only one teammate leaves the group, you can fill the other gap. You can't do everything on your own, but with some basic awareness, you can still achieve a lot. So don't let your teammates be an excuse to give up on a winnable round or a game. Finally, there is one more thing I wanted to go over, and there's a reason I was keeping it for last. That's because I know many people won't want to hear it since it has to do with agent pools. But before you grab your keyboard to start typing an angry comment, hear me out as there's a good reason I'm telling you this. When it comes to agent pools, if you're only interested in improving quickly and ranking up, don't be a fill player. Don't try to master every role, and don't even really try to learn more than 2 or 3 agents. The truth is that learning many different agents is difficult, and depending on your rank, playing certain roles is heavily punished by the ranked system. To give you an example of that, if you're a controller player, your eyes should be glued to the map at all times. You need to consider not only where the enemies might be, but also where your teammates are holding from, the weapons they're using, the weapons your enemies might be using, the information the enemy has, any potential plays your teammates might be trying to make, and so much more. But even as a good meaning controller player, it's extremely easy to lose your team around by smoking off your opper, smoking off and angled at the wrong time, or even slightly misplacing an otherwise perfectly good smoke. And it's not like it's easy to learn either. Sure, you can learn the most common smokes on each map from a YouTube video, but even the most common smokes are situational. If you use them at the wrong time, it'll actually help the enemy, and that's not always obvious to beginners. If you're a low-ranked controller player, you can't learn by looking at your teammates since they also don't know how to smoke. You can't get into fights early and often, as you need to stay alive to play a role, and you can't really look up agent guides like with other roles since smokes are too situational to go over each and every scenario. Add to that, fragging is an important factor in the lower ranks for the MMR system, and you have a role that's a recipe for disaster for the lower ranks. Now, when it comes to the other 3 roles, they're all playable for new players, but they're not made equal. Since in the lower ranks, self-sufficiency is important and fragging is heavily rewarded, duelists are ideal for learning and ranking up. Sentinels are also alright as they allow you to play both aggressively and defensively, plus they're great as lurkers on the attack side. And initiators can be good, but are also a bit iffy since many of them rely quite heavily on proper team play, which isn't always easy to find in ranked. More important than which you pick out of those 3 roles though, is that you stick to a small agent pool. Learning agents is not just knowing which abilities they have, but it's about knowing how to get the most value out of their utility in every scenario and having good execution of this knowledge. If you really want to play Brimstone, Omen, or another agent you find interesting, either do that in unrated or learn them once you've already reached a higher rank. The higher rank you are, the easier it is to pick up new agents, as not only will you have better understanding of them and the role they fill in a team, but you also have better examples of how to play them around you. Plus, you probably have more bandwidth as you're more familiar with the game. And that's all you need to know for this video. If you have any more questions, make sure to leave them down below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.